As an American entering the Gundam franchise in the early 2000s, finding the older and more venerated entries in the franchise wasn't an easy task. The original Mobile Suit Gundam partially aired on Cartoon Network's Toonami block, but was removed due to its depiction of war following the 9/11 terrorist attacks.
Good thing Bin Laden is dead.
The series was released in its entirety on VHS and DVD, though the initial DVD release was dub only, featured a yellow tint over all the footage, and for some reason after the first few volumes, they replaced the Gundam opening with the Toonami broadcast opening. I should also mention these DVDs were not easy to come by if you got into Gundam closer to 2010. The sequel, Zeta Gundam, also got a DVD release and an English dub. This DVD was actually easier to get a hold of, featured the original Japanese track with subtitles, and the only change to the opening was the removal of a Neil Sedaka song, which, honestly, thank you. No, just kidding, all things considered, it was a copyright issue, so it's understandable. Allegedly, these DVDs didn't sell well, most likely because Zeta Gundam didn't air on Toonami. Meanwhile, the Gundam OVAs would get multiple airings and lay the groundwork for Universal Century Gundam in the West. Gundam Wing and G Gundam would become Western anime staples. And for years, these two in particular would be the image most Western anime fans conjure when asked, what is Gundam? It would make sense that Bandai would look at this situation and assume the older entries were just too complex, too long, or just too old looking to garner a modern English-speaking fanbase. The problem is that they were only missing one show, a third Gundam TV series that would bridge the gap between Zeta Gundam and the film Char's Counterattack. But due to the poor performance of its predecessors, it would go undubbed and unobtainable in North America, through illegal means, for years. This third entry in the Universal Century TV lineup was Mobile Suit Gundam Double Zeta, and it would go completely ignored by Bandai in favor of promoting newer, self-contained series like Gundam Seed, or shorter self-contained OVAs like War in the Pocket or 8th MS Team. Char's Counterattack would receive a DVD release with an English dub, since a film is easier to dub than 50 episodes of a TV anime, and being from the late 80s and having a film budget meant it could sort of dodge a lot of the "it looks old" comments that First Gundam and Zeta received. But because of that, we find ourselves in an interesting situation where 2 of the 3 shows leading up to this film and the film itself are available, English dubbed, with Double Zeta just being ignored, and fans at the time didn't even seem to care. In fact, Double Zeta wasn't legally accessible in North America until 2013, when it was streamed on Bandai's now-defunct streaming service Daisuki. Luckily, in 2015, Sunrise announced that they would be releasing Double Zeta physically for the first time in North America through the distributor Right Stuff. And while Sunrise did forego dubbing the series for this release, the release is still completely worth the price, containing the entire series in crisp HD with an accurate translation. And hey, they even got the Neil Sedaka song in there. While this isn't the most comprehensive coverage of Gundam's Western releases and exposure, I really just wanted to paint a picture of how difficult being a Universal Century Gundam fan was in the 2000s. And as a result, many fans relied on word of mouth from friends, panels at conventions, and discussions on internet forums to fill in the gaps of the story they couldn't experience for themselves. This led to a minority of opinion essentially being law, and whatever the earliest consensus on a series was, that consensus became the de facto opinion by the community. In recent years, thanks to Right Stuff's Gundam releases and the accessibility of streaming, many of these series have received re-evaluations from the community. In recent years, Victory Gundam, a long despised entry in the franchise, has received more positive reception, while many of the earlier localized titles like Gundam Wing and 8th MS Team have seen an increase in vocal detractors, because they're bad. Double Zeta was a victim of these circumstances, with the lack of accessibility leading to many fans promoting the opinion that they read online or heard at conventions, and with Double Zeta those opinions weren't positive. Many decried the series as a mockery of the Universal Century's dramatic approach that lampoons the franchise and takes down several beloved characters in the process. These complaints aren't completely unfounded, as Gundam Double Zeta, unlike its 2 predecessors, is a comedy. In the first couple of episodes, the main characters, a group of teenage junkers, steal the Zeta Gundam and essentially take it for a joyride. The newly introduced villain Majmir is a far cry from the merciless titans of Zeta, and is instead more comparable to a Team Rocket or even a Time Boken trio, if you would. Another villain introduced in Double Zeta is Karasun, a female pilot who becomes aggressively horny in the presence of protagonist Judo Ashita, opening her shirt and exclaiming how hot her breasts are, and later smothering Judo with her breast whenever possible. Meanwhile, Yazan Gable, a villain from Zeta Gundam who survived the final battle, becomes the Gundam equivalent of Dick Dastardly, falling down manholes and wrestling pigs before he's eventually just written out of the show entirely by episode 8. Captain Bright Noah, a stoic figure we followed since the original Gundam, is now the center of a gag where he struggles to keep his composure around a female captain vying for his affection. I don't think a change in tone from the drama of First Gundam or Zeta to a more lighthearted show in the same universe is inherently bad, and to be quite honest, I really enjoy the earlier episodes of Gundam Double Zeta. Director Yoshiyuki Tomino knows how to portray comedy. In fact, while he's most known for Gundam, he has directed several comedy mecha shows before Double Zeta, including Daitarn 3 and Zabungle, the latter of which seems to have worked its way into the DNA of Double Zeta, as it also features a gang of teen junkers stealing mechs. The aforementioned Yazan even begins donning attire similar to Zabungle's antagonist Tim Sharon. While not your typical Gundam protagonist who fights out of a sense of duty, Judo and his friends are all fun and likable, and I genuinely enjoy their antics, like Judo using the Zeta Gundam to do a Looney Tunes-esque boxing match, or having to wrangle a furious chicken who's causing havoc on the Argama. In fact, I find the hate for this material a little weird when Yoshiyuki Tomino's earlier mecha comedies are generally well received. They haven't had as much exposure in the Anglosphere, but the few mentions of them you'll find online are generally positive. For that reason, I had to ask myself, did Double Zeta only receive a negative reputation because it has Gundam in the title? One aspect of anime criticism I wish was discussed more was how someone experienced a show. I feel like people downplay the setting of how they watched an anime and don't want to act like it affected their opinion because maybe acknowledging that makes them feel like their opinions aren't very strong. But in actuality, we're all human, and the setting and circumstance of how we experience something does affect our opinion of it. To give an example from my childhood, I loved watching Inuyasha on Adult Swim, but I never defended it when people gave it shit for being too long or having too much filler, because I agreed. Then I got older and I was able to watch it on DVD and later Blu-ray, and you know what? Inuyasha isn't that bad. The show is 130 episodes less than Dragon Ball Z, and the longest stretch of filler is a 13-episode streak before the Band of Seven, with the animation staff using this stretch of filler to transition from being hybrid cell and digital animation to full digital animation. The series contains roughly 18% filler, compared to Naruto and Bleach, which are nearly half filler, with Bleach having 3 streaks of filler which lasted 30, 38, and 44 consecutive episodes. That means that if you were watching week to week, you spent 2.4 years on filler, and one of those years was entirely the Bount arc. This isn't to say no one complains about Naruto or Bleach having too much filler, but at least they still recommend it with a caveat. It's better than telling them to skip it altogether. And I think the reason for this is because Naruto and Bleach came out later and lasted longer, long enough so that the main way of watching anime wasn't on TV from week to week anymore. To give another example that happened more recently, the newest season of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Stone Ocean was changed from a weekly release schedule to a batch drop on Netflix. For 5 seasons, it was commonplace for JoJo's fans to hype up the new episode and get excited all week to see how these iconic scenes from the manga would be adapted. Many of these scenes would go on to become memes that frequently permeated not just the JoJo's, but the anime community altogether.
Hey, you want to end the show with a to be continued meme? I don't even know what that...
But when the first 12 episodes of Stone Ocean dropped, it was basically silence. There were a few scenes I saw getting posted and some fan art, but it was the least hype I had seen come from 12 episodes of JoJo's. It made me realize that for a lot of people, the fun of watching JoJo's was the shared experience week to week of seeing how the manga would adapt certain scenes and how new fans would react to seeing those scenes for the first time. Japanese fans were the first ones to spread negative criticism of Gundam Double Zeta online, and that makes sense once you understand the setting in which they experienced it. In the final few episodes of Zeta Gundam, a huge portion of the cast are killed off in a violent battle. The main character Camille kamikazes the main villain and is left bedridden in a coma. The Neo Zeon have no one to stand against them in their rise to power, and Char has gone missing once again. Then, Double Zeta premiered its first episode the week after Zeta Gundam's finale, literally a direct follow-up to these events. Granted, the week in between there was a recap called Prelude to Double Zeta, but I don't think 1 week of recap is enough buffer for the tonal whiplash of going from the end of Zeta to the beginning of Double Zeta. You can see how Japanese fans at the time felt as though they had the rug pulled out from under them. This is why setting matters, I believe, as I was able to enjoy these early episodes because I sat down knowing full well what I was getting into, and I had no problem laughing at the goofy antics of the Argama's new crew and seeing the old faces and silly scenarios. But if you watched the finale of Zeta as it was coming out, and you wanted to see the epic follow-up and find out what happened to Char, well, Char's counterattack is 2 years away, bro. To play devil's advocate and actually kind of agree with Double Zeta haters for a second, while I do think that a lot of the hate for Double Zeta comes from early members of the fandom parroting what they heard on the Japanese side of the fandom, I will admit that even watching the series in isolation, the tone can be a bit jarring. The second half of the series has a noticeable tone shift that, when I first watched it, felt like a course correction to make the show more like Zeta. Halfway through the series, Judo's younger sister Lena is killed, and from that point on the amount of silly antics considerably drops. A new villain comes to the forefront named Rakan, who is a far cry from the silly, horny villains of Double Zeta. Rakan is a traditional Gundam villain. He is cold, hard, and confident. The stakes become even greater with a colony drop on Dublin, and the deaths of Pol, a 10-year-old who defected from the Neo Zeon because of her crush on Judo, and Hayato Kobayashi, a friend of Amuro Rei's from First Gundam. It would be one thing if the series started off goofy and fun-loving, but slowly these characters were introduced to the hard savagery of war, and the series became progressively darker as it went along. But that's not what happens here. The series starts off goofy, hard veers into darkness, but then tries to still be goofy every once in a while. For example, episode 39 features a plot where the Argama docks in a colony, only for a wealthy man from the colony to kidnap several female characters and add them to his harem. In order to get them back, Judo and Ino disguise themselves in drag to break in and rescue them. Episode 40, the follow-up to this episode, sees the death of the character Rasara at the hands of this comedic villain. A death that shatters the composure of the especially goofy Mondo and changes his perspective on life and war. This death occurs in the same scene as Judo throwing a rock into the mobile suit's opened hatch and striking this man on the head with a cartoon boing sound effect. I went looking for a source explaining why Double Zeta was given such a different tone, and a Twitter mutual of mine sent me this translation of an interview from Great Mechanics Volume 6. In it, Katsumi Kawaguchi from Bandai says the darker tone of Zeta Gundam was leading to a drop in sales, so they requested that the next Gundam be one that was lighter and more accessible. A quote, Gundam for everyone, not unlike the popular and more successful Cubics franchise. In retrospect, this made me realize the lighthearted tone of Double Zeta wasn't the misstep. The misstep happened in Zeta Gundam, and it was the lighthearted tone of Double Zeta that was the course correction. The latter half of Double Zeta wasn't the show trying to be more like Zeta, that was just Gundam straightening itself out. While it seems odd that they keep doing comedic bits throughout these episodes, that was most likely there to prevent the ending of the show from becoming the depress fest that the end of Zeta was. Which is also why, in relation to that asterisk, Judo's sister is still alive. Funny enough, I think a lot of complaints people have with the series are actually just the staff solving problems from Zeta before they happen in Double Zeta. For example, when I first started rewatching the series earlier this year, I remembered thinking that Fa had got done dirty because she's written out of the show so nonchalantly early on. But honestly, I totally get it now. Fa is a character from Zeta Gundam, and her character is tied heavily to Camille. But since Camille is not a part of the show, everything left of Fa's character overlaps with the new characters Rue and L. Writing Fa out of the show until Camille returns in Dublin prevents the show from having too many on-screen characters who overlap with each other. And do you know what show has a huge problem with characters overlapping? While I still feel there are moments in the second half of Double Zeta that are tonally jarring, understanding why these decisions were made has at least helped my relationship with these episodes. Since Right Stuff's Double Zeta release, there's been an influx of articles and social media posts defending Double Zeta, and I think that's because now viewers are able to judge it based on its own merits and faults, rather than how well it reaches the expectations and assumptions they put aside for it. And I think overall that mentality lends itself to a more worthwhile experience.